view this foundational material as they continue to go through this journey in other sessions. And then during Q&A, which will be towards the end of our programming today, if you could just simply either raise your hand like this or use the Zoom feature to raise your hand, we will happily call on you to take your questions. So I have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Rosemarie Allen. She is near and dear to my heart. She's a member of my community, and she also has served as a leader in the early childhood space for nearly 40 years. Her life work has centered on ensuring children have access to high quality early childhood programs and that they are developmentally and culturally appropriate. She's currently an associate professor in the School of Education at the Metropolitan State University in Denver. And Rosemarie has served in many state roles related to early care and education, which you can learn all about in her very extensive bio that we will place in the chat box just momentarily if it's not there already. And Dr. Allen also has a nonprofit called the Institute for Racial Equality and Excellence. And if you don't know, she also does a segment on one of our local news channels, that weekly segment, which is fantastic. And I'll try to dig a link for that and drop that in the chat box as well, because the learning is just nonstop. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosemarie Allen to the NCSL stage for the first time. And Rosemarie, welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I am super excited to be here. As Donna said, we have a lot of material to cover. A couple of warnings. One, I love that you've received the trigger warning that some of our topics may be uncomfortable, but I promise that there's no shaming or blaming and no one will walk away wounded. My hope is that we all walk away informed. This is not a passive workshop, so I do expect you to be fully engaged in asking questions. I'll answer in the chat boxes as much as possible. And then to save those questions if you have them that are more extensive for the end of the workshop. But one of the things that I've learned is that we talk about equity and inequities a lot, but rarely do we go back and look at the history of inequities in America. So many times you look at the news, especially today, and you wonder, how did we get here? So this workshop is an attempt to go back to find out where this started that will give us a roadmap to really dismantling it and creating true equity in our country. So let's start with inequities. They are embedded in America's institutions. And to show that there is inequity, but not why there is inequity, leaves too much open to interpretation. The reality is that we live in a racially structured society, and this is what causes inequity. So let's start with our first poll, and it's about defining race. Is race biological? Are we different biologically? So the poll will be set up here momentarily. Let me know when it's launched. So you can answer yes, maybe, no, or I don't know. And we know that there are 25 of you in this workshop, so we're going to wait to see if we have 25 answers. There is no wrong answer, so please feel free to keep voting. Here we go.
That may be all of the responses right there, so we can go.
Alrighty. Let's end the poll and launch the results. Share results. So here we are. So overwhelmingly, the majority says no. So you are right. Actually, let me close this out. Race is a social construct. It's all made up. It was made up in order to classify human beings, and that is politically defined. So underneath our skin, where we are underneath our skin, we are 98% alike. I just want to stop for a moment to make sure you're recording. Okay, we're 98% alike. So that means that my heart will beat in the heart of anyone, regardless of race, as long as the blood type and tissue stuff match. Race is all made up. Again, we are more alike than we are different. And once you peel back the skin, we are basically all the same. So race was completely made up to classify human beings. Now, although race is a social construct, it's really important to understand that because there's a classification, there is a high value placed on white skin above other skin. So even though it's made up, socially there is value based on race. I just want to make sure that's clear. So what came first? Did race come before racism? This is another poll. True or false? Go ahead and cast your votes. You all are just amazing here. So yes, we're going to launch the results, share the results. Absolutely. So racism came before race. Ta-Nehisi Coates says that racism is the parent and race is the child. And race and racism began with the opportunism to hold power and wealth. And racism is what led to slavery. And it resulted in this creation of race to create a wedge between classes. Remember, we talked about that classification system in order to justify the institution of slavery. And it's embedded into our practices, fictitious sciences, and policies to hold on to the ability to dehumanize people so that you could enslave them for free labor. And it led to widespread prejudices and biases. So what we're going to talk about is how race was codified in our American system. First, labor status was not permanent, solely connected to race. So when enslaved Africans were here in this country, laws were passed in order to create hereditary slavery. And this happened because before this law was passed in 1662 in Virginia, hereditary status was passed through the father. It was patriarchal. So what happened then, if a father impregnated an enslaved African, then that child would be free because the father was free. But they found that that did not work during the times of slavery. So they enacted this law in 1662 of hereditary slavery, which meant that the status of the mother determined the status of the child. And that's really important to know because children of enslaved women were automatically given the title of slave. So what happened is this is how America was able to build its slave population. It laid the foundation for the natural increase of the enslaved people here in America, and it legitimized the exploitation of female slaves by white planters or other men. So when the law changed that when the masters raped enslaved women, their children became enslaved people. So this is really, really important for us to know how slavery continued to grow long after the slave trade even ended. So here's our last poll. Slavery and segregation was a long time ago. Is that true or false? Okay. This is amazing. I am just so impressed with you all. 100% of the people who responded said that's false, and it is false. And it's really important that we understand that it's false, because you'll hear, especially from some of your constituents, or even within your own families and communities, why are we talking about slavery? It was so long ago. Aren't we over this by now? But I want to call your attention to this timeline. Here from 1619, when the first indentured slaves or enslaved Africans were brought to the country, 246 years of American slavery. And we know that it ended with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. But that really wasn't the end of slavery. It was the end of forced labor as it existed during that period. But right after slavery, we had almost 90 years of segregation, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and we're still fighting for social justice and equity and equality. And it was only in 1954 that this idea that Black people and other people of color are actually equal, that we're all equals in America, that's my lifetime. Donna says, I am only 4 generations removed from slavery, which means that her second great grandparent was enslaved. So it's not a long time at all. This notion of being equal in America is very, very new. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. So are things better today? Let's take a look at this film.
The United States is often called the Great Melting Pot, but it's a country that's struggled with race relations throughout its history and still does today. A 2015 CNN and Kaiser Family Foundation poll found about half of Americans think racism is a big problem, one that doesn't seem to be getting better. 2/3 said racial tensions in the United States had increased over the last decade. More than half of Blacks said they had experienced some form of racial discrimination in their lifetimes, from being denied a job to fearing for their lives. About 1/3 of whites and Hispanics reported similar experiences. Blacks and Hispanics were also far more likely than whites to say that they had been unfairly treated in the last month in a public place, such as a restaurant or in a store, because of their race. Segregation is still a reality as well, at work and at home. 60% of whites said their work colleagues were all or mostly white, and close to 70% of whites said either their social circle or their neighborhood was mostly white. When asked if certain factors, like discrimination, a lack of educational opportunities, and broken families, played a major role in the social and economic problems facing their communities, the majority of Blacks and Hispanics said yes. But even so, there is optimism. A majority of Blacks and Hispanics aged 18 to 34 say it's easier for them to achieve the American dream than it was for their parents. Only 31% of young white adults said the same.
Interesting, isn't it? When you think about the way things were during the Brown versus Board of Education decision, do you know that we are more segregated now than we were then? We are very, very segregated in America. Even look at our schools, where more than 80% of teachers are white. There are children who never get to see a person of color in the position of authority until they're adults. And that's a problem. We know that when children see teachers who look like them, when they have the same race teacher, studies show that those children do far better, even if they have one teacher the same race. But people always ask me, well, what's the damage that's done to white children if they don't see different races? What happens is that white children in our schools, they only get to see people of color in positions that serve them. Cafeteria workers, janitors, bus drivers, front office workers. So they've not had an opportunity to interact with people of color who have authority over them, and it creates lots of issues when they're an adult. So Representative Tana Sin, and I hope I'm saying that right, said broken families seems like a loaded term. Isn't that white construct too? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely it is, because families aren't broken and families don't need to be fixed. And those of you who may remember terms, when we think about terms, what were the, before single parents, children were illegitimate, if you remember that. They were illegitimate. But then when white mothers began to be single heads of household, they became single families. So we want to be very, very concerned and very conscious of the terms that we use. So we know that things are not better today. But I want to introduce you to Jamal. And we're going to walk through the rest of our presentation through Jamal's eyes and his family's. So we want to see this through the eyes of a child, since all of you are early childhood fellows. So Jamal is 5 years old. His mother is a college professor. His father is a corporate lawyer. And his ACE score is 5. And his mother is of the highest educated demographic in the country. And there are some studies that show that Black women with PhDs or EDDs are the most highly educated in our country. So let's take a look at Jamal. He's been suspended from 3 preschools. And he's tested as gifted and talented, but he's also disciplined a lot for being too active. And what we know is that Black boys are more likely to be suspended from school than any other demographic. Dr. Walter Gilliam, who conducted the first suspension study for preschoolers, and is now conducting amazing studies, he talks about 3 Bs. 3 Bs is being a boy, being a big boy, being a Black boy. I added a D to that. So it's 3 Bs and a D. Being a big Black boy with disabilities, you're the most likely to be suspended from school. And we know that suspended children are 10 times more likely to enter the juvenile justice system. And we also know that Black boys who are raised in wealthy families earn less as adults than white boys in similar backgrounds. And rich white boys are much more likely to remain rich, while rich Black boys, when they grow up, they're much more likely to become poor. But this is the land of opportunity. So why is this? And how does it happen? Well, let's take a look back. So Representative Drummond says, how the heck does suspension from preschool work? Representative, you will be absolutely shocked. If you get a chance to look at my TED Talk, Donna, if you can, or someone can put a link in the chat box. Not only are preschoolers suspended, but infants and toddlers. My research shows that children start getting suspended at 8 months of age while they're still in the crib, while they're still in diapers, before they walk and talk. And even at that age, Black children are disproportionately suspended. The number one and two reason for suspensions of infants and toddlers is excessive crying and biting. And we know that's a child's job. If you have a child that's less than 2 years old, they're gonna bite and they're gonna cry when they're unhappy because they don't have words yet. And then you have preschoolers who are suspended. And what we're finding is that they're suspended for being preschoolers, which means that we have to give our teachers a lot more support in how to handle typical behaviors of children so that we can keep children in school. So let's take a look back. The year is 1670. Jamal's 6th great-grandfather was stolen from East Africa and enslaved in New Orleans, Louisiana. And 5 years later, there was an act that was passed. It was the Act Concerning Servants and Slaves, and it allowed the slave master to kill their slave with impunity, that they would not be held accountable for a slave's death. Shortly after that was the Naturalization Act, and it set the criteria for naturalization to 2 years of residency proof of good moral character, and an oath to support the Constitution. So this essentially gave white immigrants citizenship and the right to vote and gave them political power. Representative Drummond says this is outrageous. Alaska's population is about 16% Alaskan Native, with many communities 100% Alaskan Native. Our Black population is maybe 3%, but the inequities persist. Thank you for sharing that. So the Naturalization Act gave white immigrants citizenship, the right to vote, and political power. So 3 generations later, Jamal's ancestors were still enslaved. They were not allowed to read or write. They didn't even count as a full person and suffered all of the atrocities of slavery. Then, in the meantime, we had several more acts that were enacted. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act. It was signed into law and it authorized the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. And a few years after that was the Treaty of Guadalupe, and it ended the war between the US and Mexico. And Mexico ended up ceding 55% of its territory, including parts of what's now known as Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Nevada, and Utah to the United States. You may want to read more about this Treaty of Guadalupe and to see how it still impacts our Mexican immigrants and citizens here today, and some of the trauma that's still in their DNA. And also you may want to do a little research to find out how this entire treaty was designed actually to expand slavery. You might want to take a peek at that. And then we had the 1862 Homestead Act, which granted 160 acres of federal land to US citizens. And was it federal land is what we have to ask. Who did the land really belong to? And did it have something to do with the Indian Removal Act? So you may want to put that together. And it granted this land to any US citizen, and it was virtually free if that person lived on the land for 5 years and improved the land by building a home or producing a crop. And this legislation was intended to give incentive to really settle the Western frontier and aid in the continuing territorial expansion of the United States during the 19th century. But during this time, as Indians were removed from their land and pushed out, Jamal's ancestors were still enslaved. And by the end of the act, more than 270 million acres of Western land had been transferred to individuals, almost all of whom were white. And then came the 13th Amendment. And Jamal's 4th great-grandfather was freed from slavery. Should have had a poll here that says, but were they really free? So we know that the 13th Amendment banned slavery and all involuntary servitude, except in the case of punishment for a crime. So I want you to think about this. We're going to break into groups in a minute, but think about, were those formerly enslaved people in a position to live as free people? What were the barriers that kept them from being free, truly free? What supports were provided to the formerly enslaved, and what supports were needed? So while you're thinking about that, there's just a couple of things that I want to say. You hear me say enslaved people or enslaved Africans. It's really important, again, to make sure we use language that tells the story, the true story. People say, oh, the slaves, they brought slaves over from Africa. They actually didn't bring slaves over. They brought people over. They brought Africans over who were chiefs and priests and teachers and educators. And when they came to America, they enslaved them. So they brought free people over from the continent and enslaved them. And that's why I use the term enslaved Africans or enslaved people. So now that you've had a chance to think, if you'd like, you can take out your phone and take a picture of this slide. And we're going to give you a little under 10 minutes to have a discussion and come back and report out to the group. All righty, let's go into our groups. Like everyone has returned, and this is awesome because I get to see your faces. Of course, when you're sharing the screen, I can't see faces, so I'm really, really excited to see you right now. Let's just report out and share some of the things that you thought about. The first question was, were those formerly enslaved people in a position to live as free? What were some of the discussions in your group? Just feel free to unmute yourself. Now I know you all were talking. Okay, I see Walker Stevens.
They absolutely were not free because, you know, when you might be free, but when you can't read and write and your family can't read and write and your family's been disenfranchised for generations and hasn't been able to build wealth, and you don't have any property and you don't have an ability to get educated and you can't live where you want to live and get a job, then you're not in a position to be free.
So let's see here. So what codes, practices, policies were put in place to ensure that the labor existed, even though the formerly enslaved people are now freed? Let's see if I can get this to play.
Mr. President, I have a brother about 14 years old. A man hired him from me and I heard of him no more. He went and sold him to McGree and they've been working him in prison for 12 months. I asked him to let me have him, but he won't let him go.
For a period of nearly 80 years between the Civil War and World War II, Black Southerners were no longer slaves, but they were not yet free. In one of the most shameful and little-known chapters of American history, generations of Black Southerners were forced to labor against their will.
From almost the first moment, white Southerners were responding to try to put African Americans back into a position as close to slavery as they possibly could.
The Old South and what was quickly becoming the New South could not proceed without the work of African Americans.
But if you had something for free in the past, you don't necessarily want to pay for it now.
It was a straight, simple, exploitative system. There's only power, there's only force, there's only brutality. What happened in that period of time was so much more terrible than anything most Americans recognize or understand today. The depth of poverty, the inability of African Americans to access any of the mechanisms of wealth achievement and growth, are all rooted in this terroristic kind of regime that existed in so many places.
Their ability to have what we call the American dream. That is what has been stolen from Black folks all through the South. And that legacy has to be understood so that people will be able to speak to it and give our ancestors voice.
So what happened right after slavery were these Black codes. And these Black codes regulated the behavior, the activities, and freedoms of now freed Blacks. But what they did, they essentially re-enslaved Black people. The forced labor, like you just saw. And there were Black codes that said that if you were committed, charged with a crime, then you can be forced into labor. Remember way back, a few slides ago, the 13th Amendment, the exception was that no slavery except for a commission of a crime. And this is how a lot of formerly enslaved people were re-enslaved because of these Black codes. One of the crimes was vagrancy. So that meant if you were not working, loitering, if you were just standing around on a street corner. And once they re-enslaved you, then they had what they called apprenticeships for your children, which basically forced them back into labor as well. Here's an example of some of the Black codes. And you're right, Representative, some of the photos looks like Jews in concentration camps. Isn't that amazing? Yes. And children in ICE prisons now. Here's an example of Black codes.
In November and December 1865, shortly after the end of the Civil War, Southern states sought to control their large populations of newly freed Black people. Laws were passed authorizing the arrest and jailing of Blacks. These laws became known as Black codes. They typically applied only to Blacks and criminalized acts that were not offenses when committed by whites. On November 24, 1865, Mississippi passed a Black Code declaring that all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes found without proof of employment or found unlawfully assembling themselves would owe up to $50 in fines and serve up to 10 days in jail. As a result of Black codes, the post-Civil War era brought American Black citizens more contact with the criminal courts and prison systems than ever before. As the former Confederacy learned to use the criminal justice system as a tool of racial control, countless Black men, women, and children were convicted and sentenced under unjust laws that criminalized them for existing as free Black citizens.
You get to think about what he said here. Think about what he said, and then think about how it applies to modern times. I'm going to go back a little bit.
For existing as free men, women, and children were convicted and sentenced under unjust laws that criminalized them for existing as free Black citizens.
And think about the way prisoners were used then and the way prisoners are used today. Who's fighting California's fires right now? Is there anyone here from California? Who's fighting the fires in California right now?
Incarcerated prisoners.
Incarcerated prisoners. And people say, well, that's great because now they're getting these skills and they can come out and be firefighters. It wasn't until 2 weeks ago when the governor passed a law that said that they can now become firefighters, that they could. Because before they were fighting fires and could never be firefighters because you couldn't have a felony and be a firefighter. So again, free labor. Do you know that the work of prisoners, they make things for Target? Forever 21, prisoners are creating retail goods for people today. So I just want you to see what happened then is still happening now. And Eva Roberts says that just the fact that we have photographs from this area reinforces the fact it wasn't that long ago. And Wade said that they discussed the long-term benefits of the Homestead Act to primarily white families and the generational disadvantage that it created for people of color. And they also discussed the long-term benefits of education available for those who had access to education and the corresponding disadvantages to those who were denied access. Absolutely. Yes, Melissa, that the children were charged. And Representative Drummond, fire jumper squads from rural Alaska and California too. Yes, I don't want to say only prisoners are fighting fires, but an overwhelming number of them are. So let's keep going. So Jamal's grandfather became a sharecropper. I have to share with you that my grandfather was a sharecropper too. And actually, the woman in the big house, which was the former plantation, fell in love with my grandmother. And when they moved and sold their house, they gave my grandmother their furniture. And that furniture sits in my living room today. That's how close we are to this. So his grandfather became a sharecropper. And what is sharecropping? Former enslaved people established subsistence farms on the land that had been abandoned by the Union Army. And then President Andrew Johnson restored this land to the former owners. So many former enslaved people became trapped in this new system of economic exploitation known as sharecropping. And this is where we're really beginning to see the wealth gap. We saw it as Representative Fickler discussed with the Homestead Act, but here the sharecropping period made it impossible for Black people to generate and pass down wealth because they owned nothing but their labor, and they were left with no cash and in perpetual debt because the master, the owners, they kept the books. So they, at the end of every year, the sharecroppers ended up owing, so they could never ever get out of debt. And shortly after that came the Compromise of 1877. So following the Civil War, the protections that were put in place to protect the rights of African Americans were rescinded, and federal troops were withdrawn. So these Southern whites resorted to all forms of intimidation and violence to keep Black people from voting and to restore white supremacy in the region. And this is when Jim Crow was established. So now we're here at Jamal's second great-grandfather. I'm sorry, in the other slide, it should have been his third great-grandfather. Forgive my typo there. So here's Jamal's second great-grandfather, and he fled the terror of the South. And many of you read about this in your history books as the Great Migration. This was Black people fleeing the South. One of the greatest books, I believe, that was written during this period is called The Warmth of Other Suns. Magnificent book, historical novel. Once you start reading it, you will not want to put it down, but it's a great history of this period. So we had that first Great Migration, then we had the Great Depression. The 1930s worsened the already bleak economic status of African Americans. They were the first to be laid off from their jobs. The unemployment rate was 2 to 3 times that of white people. And Blacks received substantially less aid than whites. And a lot of the charitable organizations excluded Black people from their soup kitchens and from other forms of aid. Then in 1933, the New Deal and the National Recovery Act was enacted. But this created unfair wages and exclusion of Blacks from unions. So then they had to form and organize their own separate unions, such as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. But even when they tried to organize, they were often found themselves to be targets of lynch mobs in the North and the South. Then shortly after that, a year or two later, we had the Social Security Act because people needed aid. But the Social Security Act of 1935 excluded coverage for about half of the workers in America. And the largest groups that were excluded were agricultural and domestic workers. And that's exactly where African Americans worked, in agriculture in homes as domestics. So they were excluded from the Social Security Act. Now, it's really important to point out here as lawmakers that we see how racism was codified in our laws, but it was about this time that they didn't call out race specifically. They began to call out groups of people. So by excluding agricultural workers and domestic workers, they didn't say we're excluding Blacks, but that's where the majority of Black people were. So we want to pay attention to that language. So after returning from World War II, Jamal's second great-grandfather, Joe, he wanted to use his GI Bill to buy a home for his family. Let's look at the GI Bill, because on the surface, it looked like it was for any veteran. But here, Joe, he wanted to move into his newly created suburb in his hometown, but it wasn't open to Blacks. Segregation still existed in the North and the South. It allowed white veterans to prosper and accumulate wealth in post-war years, but the GI Bill did not deliver on its promise to veterans of color. It's a contributing factor in driving the gaps in wealth, education, civil rights between Black and white Americans, very much like Wade Fickler talked about earlier in the chat box. And you may be asking, how is that? How did that happen? While the GI Bill's language didn't specifically exclude Black veterans, there was a push for the bill to be administered at the state level rather than the federal level, where more racist influences existed. And the inequities in the GI Bill included segregated schools, so they could use their GI Bill to go to school, but schools were still segregated. And many of the vocational schools had inadequate supplies. So they couldn't learn to be plumbers and electricians and things like that because the adequate equipment was only available to white students. And then there was this simple fear of being lynched if you were to rise above your so-called station. And then there was inequitable implementation in unemployment benefits. And then something that still impacts us today, redlining. And redlining is this decades-old practice of marking maps by race to characterize the risk of lending money and providing insurance in certain areas. And it made purchasing a home much more difficult and sometimes impossible for Black veterans or for Black people overall. And lenders froze out poor neighborhoods, ensuring that loan assistance and insurance would be denied. New white suburbs often came with overtly racist covenants that denied entry to Black people. Here's a little homework assignment. Dig up the history of the neighborhood where you live. See if you can locate some of the covenants. I located some of the covenants right here in Colorado that specifically excluded Black people from moving here in Douglas County, which is truly amazing. But how did this impact Jamal? Let's see.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and get accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately,
And there we are. So in our chat box, it says, Donna's father was her father was a sharecropper in Alabama. And Representative Sin says, and needing ID to prove who you are is reminiscent of rules to keep Blacks from voting today. Yes. I know they're excluded from most labor laws not sure about Social Security. Oh, when the question is, are agricultural workers and domestic workers still excluded today? And I'm not sure. That's something I need to find out. So Rebecca Millay, great idea. How do we find covenants from that far away? And Representative Drummond said that he received them with the title of his house. And Shannon found a Social Security bulletin that examines the expansion of SSI. It looks like it was expanded to cover farm and domestic workers in 1950. Thank you so much for that, Shannon.
this is
So Jamal's grandfather, he ended up buying an overpriced house in a low income neighborhood with a very, very high interest rate. And because that's the only place he could go, they found that there are a lot of environmental issues. Physical conditions such as heat, cold, energy efficient ventilation, those were some of the issues. There were chemical issues such as carbon monoxide, secondhand smoke, and lead. Biological conditions existed such as rodents, house dust mites, roaches, humidity, and mold. And I don't know if I had lead in there. Lead should be there as well. And then social conditions, for example, related to mental health. So not only was Jamal's grandfather subjected to those, but so was Jamal's father, who grew up in that house. And Jamal's grandfather ended up with some serious health issues because of this. He was diabetic, overweight, and had high blood pressure. But even so, Jamal's grandfather pushed Jamal's father to get an education because there's the belief that education is the ticket out of poverty. So now we have Jamal's dad. He graduated from law school, but he has $200,000 in student loans because his family was not in a position to help him. He actually ended up helping take care of his parents, but his family had very little capital to purchase a home because they were in such an undesired neighborhood and didn't have much equity. And Jamal found that he was often feared by coworkers and strangers as a Black man. And he was stopped by the police on a regular basis. Jamal's mother, she suffered from racial trauma. You see that chocolate skin on his mother's face? She was a victim of colorism, where the lighter you are and the closer to white, the more accepted you were. So she suffered from this trauma of colorism, of microaggressions. She had to code switch whenever she was in a so-called professional environment. And for some of you who may not understand, the term code switching is changing your way of being so that you can assimilate into the culture. So changing your hair. I worked for state government for years and I never ever wore my hair curly. I straightened my hair for the 10 years I worked in state government because I was afraid of appearing too ethnic. So that's a form of code switching. The way that you talk, the clothes that you wear, your mannerisms. I have a very good friend who's a very dark Black man who's 6'5". And one day he said, Rosemarie, I'm so tired of shrinking so white women will feel comfortable and not fear me. And that broke my heart. That is a form of code switching. And Senator Kavanaugh said, that's why the Crown Act is so important. It is absolutely important. And remember, I talked about how Black children, preschoolers, are suspended? Little Black girls are 19% of the female preschool population, but 54% of those suspended. You know the top two reasons they're suspended? Sassiness and hair. They're suspended for their hair. They're suspended because of the way they wear their hair, the dress codes, and when other children touch their hair and the teachers don't protect them because they don't understand the cultural aspects of not touching Black people's hair. It's really amazing. So yes, the Crown Act is very, very, very important. Senator Claire Wilson says that great resources are inequities making us sick. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing this resource. And now Jamal's mother has health issues. She had gestational diabetes when she was pregnant with Jamal, preeclampsia, and spent 3 days in ICU following Jamal's birth. Do you know that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women? I almost witnessed it firsthand when my niece had a baby, April 1st, 2019. They overhydrated her and they could not get her blood pressure to come back up. And after they determined they were taking her to ICU, a nurse came in with a bag of fluid. And I happened to be there and I said, what are you doing with that? Oh, we're gonna hydrate her. I said, she's overhydrated. That's why she's going to ICU. And the nurse said, no, she's not. Something that was wrong. And I said, please take the time to read her chart. I don't want her to die today. The nurse didn't bother to read her chart. This is the impact of implicit bias and how it leads to these inequities. Then this precious baby boy was born. Here's Jamal, and he was born 4 weeks early, low birth weight, and he was in the NICU for 2 days. We have to understand that Jamal is impacted not only by what's happening to him today, because he's 5 years old, but what's in his DNA, what happened to his 6th great grandfather all the way through the history that we just walked through. During Jamal's early years, his ACEs score is 5. And I know you all have gone over ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And why is his score so high with his mother a professor and his father a lawyer? Well, his mother suffered from postpartum depression. And she was so depressed that she and her husband separated for 6 months. And then his father contracted COVID, remember? He had diabetes and he was overweight. He contracted COVID and he had to move in with the family. And then he was drinking heavily. And then he often cussed at and humiliated Jamal. Those are the points right there that caused Jamal's score to go up. And here we have Jamal. Again, he's been suspended from 3 preschools. But he's a brilliant, brilliant little boy. And he's often disciplined for being too active. Let's look at the data around children in suspensions. The 2016 United States Department of Office of Civil Rights data shows that there are patterns of racial and gender disproportionality in the way children are suspended. First, boys. Boys represent 54% of the preschool population, but 78% of those who are suspended. And African-American preschoolers are almost 4 times more likely to be suspended than their white friends. 40 years of studies show that Black children are up to 4 times more likely to be suspended than white students. But not only are they suspended more, but they're more harshly disciplined also. Dr. Walter Gilliam, who I talked about earlier, he conducted a survey that showed that preschool teachers judge children's behaviors differently based on race. Let's take a peek. Teachers were asked to watch a video clip of 4 children in order to anticipate challenging behaviors. And in the video clips were these 4 children. There was a black girl, black boy, white girl, white boy, and the children were all child actors. And these were the directions that were given to the participants. It says, we're interested in learning about how teachers detect challenging behaviors in the classroom. Sometimes this involves seeing behavior before it becomes problematic. The video segments you're about to view are of preschoolers engaging in various activities. Some clips may or may not contain challenging behaviors. Your job is to press the enter key on the external keypad every time you see a behavior that could become a potential challenge. Now, what the participants didn't know was that all the children were child actors. There were no challenging behaviors at all in the video clips. They also didn't know that the researchers were using eye tracking devices so they could see which children were being watched. And all the children were engaged in the same level of play. And these are the results. The black boy was watched more than any other child. And 42% of the teachers reported that he actually required more of their attention. The black girl was watched more often than white children. White children were watched least of all. This might give us some insight into why Black children are suspended. You find the problem behavior where you look for it. And even though all the children were engaged in the same level of play, the black boy was watched and it was perceived that he needed more attention than the other children. Let's take a look at how this impacts Jamal.
And there, a big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism.
So, I think since I am ahead of time, I can't believe it, I am going to put you all back into groups. And I want you to think about how systemic racism is still impacting people today. So when we look back from Jamal's grandfather, who bought his home, and what happened to him, what happened to Jamal's father, Jamal's mother, and now Jamal. Talk about the impact of systemic racism on African Americans and other people of color today. So why don't we break into groups to do that? You'll have about, we'll just give about 5 minutes. Is that okay? All righty. And while you're breaking into groups, Representative Sen says an insight into why kids of color feel uncomfortable with school resource officers. Absolutely.
All right, Allison, can you put us back in? There we go.
Yeah, they're going.
Hi again. Scott and Senator Wilson's joining us from Washington.
Hi. Sorry I was late. I had a caucus meeting. Unfortunately, it took priority. So
no worries. Thanks for
letting me in when I knocked.
So the question is how does systemic racism, structural racism continue to impact Jamal and his family? And we've Dr. Allen gave us several examples, but I'm just going to open it up, whoever wants to jump in. We saw a little bit in housing, school, early childhood policy, or his early childhood preschool center.
What I would say is that it has existed, it continues to exist, and it's all been exacerbated by COVID-19. So we have a historic, issue, but we also have an issue that is of even greater concern now as we look at what's happened in our country when we think about economic recovery. And if we don't start thinking about.
So we know that this impacts Jamal. In your small groups, you talked about the impact of systemic racism. And we know how this impacts Black boys even today, that they're more likely to be suspended from school. Suspended children are 10 times more likely to enter juvenile justice. And some of the things I said earlier during the presentation. And now we know exactly how this happens. It's historical. It didn't happen out of nowhere. So we want to define equity. And equity is the condition that will be achieved when race no longer predicts outcomes. Wouldn't that be amazing? I mean, when we say all children will thrive, all citizens will thrive, and all really means all. And as a Black woman, my race will not dictate what diseases I get. If I die in childbirth, what my educational level will be, what will happen to my child, where I will live, and what some of the diseases are. Wouldn't that be amazing if race no longer predicted that? So as we begin to wrap up, this is our last group and our last slides. I want you to think about what you can do. I gave you a lot of information. And Shannon Saw says that her group discussed experiences of racial bias they have witnessed or heard about. Senator Sykes shared a story from a constituent who is a Black business owner and was followed by police and asked if he had permission to enter his own gym. He had the keys to the building, but the police told him that that didn't mean he had permission. He was only able to prove that he was supposed to be there because there was a picture of him on the wall in the gym. Just amazing. And I can tell you so many stories about how my handsome, amazing, incredibly sensitive son walking in our own neighborhood had the police called on him multiple times, but I was able to work with the police department to make sure that he wasn't hurt or unnecessarily stopped. So what can you do? What policy actions can you take? And when you come back, we just want you to share any policy option or opportunity that you foresee taking to address this issue. So this last breakout, you'll have 8 minutes so that we can then enter into a Q&A period. So
hey, Rosemarie, we're actually going to give them less than that so we can make sure that we have time for Eva to do her final comments as well. So how about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and do some Q&A, and then we'll get ourselves back on track, because this time got away from us now.
Yes, it did, and I thought I was doing so well. 5 minutes, okay. Let's break into groups and we'll see you in 5.
Okay. Okay, I'll start off. There's 2 areas that I'm working in. One, I'm in a work group with our Iowa Public Health Association on centering around socially determined health with and racial impacts component of that. So we're trying to find alignment where work is going on in different areas across the state at different levels so we can coordinate some of that effort. And then I'm also pursuing some involvement in our juvenile justice work with minority contacts and efforts to improve in those areas.
Jenny just put it in the chat box. When it comes to putting equity at the core of policy, what are some common misperceptions people have? and how can legislators combat these misperceptions and communicate more effectively? So if you have any thoughts on that, not to—
Absolutely, I do. One, I'll go first to a graphic that many of you have seen. And the graphic shows 3 little people.
Yeah.
One is short, one medium sized, one tall. And the first frame, they're all standing. No, they all have a box. They have one box. And that box is, we give, that's equality. And then the next frame shows equity. But if you look closely at that frame, it looks like we took the box from the tallest kid and gave it to another child. That's not how equity works. So the biggest misconception about equity is that something has to be taken from one person or one group, one demographic. They must sacrifice so that this other demographic can benefit. That's the misconception. That's not true, and that will never sell. We give supports to people who need it. So when you think, if you use that graphic, just say, this graphic is wrong. We're not talking about taking this box from this kid. Everybody keeps their same box, but these children might need more because of A, B, and C. So that's one of the most common misconceptions. And the other common misconception is anytime we think that we're anti something, you have to be pro something else. So when we talk about anti-racism, yes, that box. Thank you very much. You see what I'm talking about there? Don't take the box from the tall kid. It's okay that he has the box. Just make sure that you even the playing field for everyone else. And when you talk about being pro this, it doesn't mean you're anti that. So those are the 2 most common misconceptions. And you have to, you have to present this in a way that where people can see themselves. If I may, just one more point, Donna, is we made a really, really big mistake in the 80s when we started talking about diversity and multicultural stuff. We defined diversity as everything that wasn't white. That was a mistake. And white people did not see themselves in this conversation. We must change that. We must recognize that everyone is a cultural being. We all bring our own cultural lens with us, and everyone wins. So be very careful when you're talking about diversity. You're not leaving out white people because they are part of this conversation and have needs that are great as well.
Yeah.
All right.
That's good stuff, Dr. Allen. Thank you so much. Thank you. I want to turn it over to Eva. Wade mentioned Eva and where she was from earlier. And so Eva, if you can just, take us home and give us a few parting words before we end.
Sure. Thank you, Donna. And thanks to all of you for letting me be here today. I was really going to just be a fly on the wall, but I love these conversations. And I started my career as a staffer for a governor. So I really like thinking about this policy work. And so thanks for letting me jump in today. And maybe
Eva, you went on mute.
Oh, there we go. And just a huge thank you to Dr. Allen. I've heard so much about your work over time, particularly from my colleagues at the Buffett Institute in Nebraska. And I'm just really delighted to have had a chance to hear from you today and have you walk us through these issues that we're all reckoning with as a field and as a country. As Donna said, I'm with the Buffett Early Childhood Fund. We're based in Omaha, but we work nationally and invest in practice, policy, and science to maximize the potential of the youngest and most vulnerable children and their families in the country. And we support the fellowship because we really want to help policymakers craft the best possible policies and make the most impactful investments possible on behalf of young children and their families. So kudos to you all for having participated in that fellowship, and even more so to come back for more right now when I know you're all juggling so much. And this year, of course, like everything else, this has had to be reinvented. And so we're really grateful to NCSL for your creativity and innovation and adapting for these unusual times. The moment that we're in is marked not just by COVID-19, but this reckoning with racism that we're having. And we at BECF felt it was really important for NCSL to put that front and center this year and create this series through a race equity lens to recognize and leverage that power of the moment. And we also believe that children grow and develop in the context of their families and their communities. So we're really delighted that this year's series zooms out a little bit and will take a more holistic look at the wide range of factors that can support or stunt children's healthy development. So if you enjoyed today and you're eager for more, we do hope you'll come back for the remaining 4 sessions in the series. And I know that you'll have all the information, but I'll just kind of quickly run through what those topics are. And as Dr. Allen said, you will revisit Jamal and his family kind of through these different focus areas. So the next session will be on health and safety and look more at adverse childhood experiences, the accumulated toxic stress on child development, racial bias in healthcare came up a lot in the breakouts I was in, and the related policy solutions to improve children and families' health and safety outcomes. Session 3 will focus on housing and economic security, looking at kind of the ongoing impacts of those redlining topics that we talked about and the importance of safe, stable, and affordable housing, whole family approaches to employment, the issue of benefits cliffs, consumer financial protection, access to capital, and other matters related to family economic security. Session 4, access to high quality early care and education, near and dear to our foundation's heart, will really address the importance of access to high quality early care and education and parent support programs, drawing attention to childcare deserts, preschool suspensions and expulsions. So definitely going deeper on that topic, home visiting, and the issue of the early childhood workforce, a lot of equity issues there. And then the 5th and final session will look at home and community and really look at that sort of ecosystem that children grow up in, with special attention to policies that can disproportionately impact children and families of color. In the meantime, do look out for an evaluation from today's session to help NCSL refine the program and better meet your needs. And just thank you again for your leadership in this time where we need it more than ever, and your interest in these issues that are really impacting thousands of children, millions of children's lives, and really our state and our nation. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Eva. This actually concludes our program. I'm so grateful and thankful to Dr. Allen and to Eva and the Buffett Foundation and all of the NCSL staff that, just made this possible today. And so we're around if you have, questions or you want to dig deeper or things have come up for you that you want to ask us, please don't hesitate to reach out to the early care and education team here. And Shannon just dropped in the chat box a link to the evaluation. So if you have a few moments to take that, we would be incredibly grateful for your feedback as well. So Dr. Allen, thank you so much for spending this last 2 hours for us and making it feel like 10 minutes because time went by so quickly. So thank you so much for being with us on our kickoff session. I feel like there was lots of learning, lots of questions, and lots of possibilities that await us. So please join us for session 2. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll be in touch soon.
All righty, bye now.
Bye-bye.